A 90-year-old woman was on the verge of giving a nasty biker gang a lesson they would never forget in the peaceful village of Duskwood, Virginia. Until the day the Midnight Serpents aired by pestering Elizabeth Lizzy Winters at a nearby gas station, she appeared to be just another elderly resident. This seemingly innocent grandma was actually one of Vietnam's most accomplished chopper pilots, having completed more than 200 successful rescue missions behind enemy lines, something the infamous gang was blissfully unaware of. Lizzy made the one phone call that would alter everything when their intimidation became too much. The vicious rogue and his Midnight Serpents were under the impression that they were dealing with a pushover. Lizzy had rescued 50 battle-hardened veteran bikers from the Vietnamese jungles decades ago, and now they were standing face to face with them. An unexpected change that would alter Duskwood's destiny for all time emerged from a day of bullying and abuse. Please identify your viewing location before we go ahead with the narrative. We have a unique story waiting for you tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed this one. At the crack of dawn, Lizzy Winters set out on her daily grind as the sun warmed the peaceful streets of Duskwood. Her posture remained amazingly straight after years of military service, and her silver hair was perfectly pulled back. For the past 3 decades, she had driven her beat-up Ford Taurus into Mike's Gas and Go. With a sincere and bright smile, Jimmy, the young attendant, was called upon by Mrs. Winters to say good morning. The same old thing. As Lizzy cautiously exited her car, Jimmy was informed that it was just a full tank. The self-control that had served her well for so many years was on full display in her deliberate gait. The aroma of gasoline and morning dew wafted through the air as she started to fill her tank. Later that morning, she had meetings scheduled at the VA, and her thoughts began to drift to those. These get-togethers were more than that, they served as a bridge to her heritage and the people who had served before her. The quiet morning was broken by the faraway sound of motorbikes. The ominous growl intensified until the tiny gas station was resounded by the rumble of engines. As the number of motorcycles entered the lot increased from 5 to 15, the morning sun reflected off their shiny chrome. It was the arrival of the Midnight Serpents. As Lizzy observed them via the reflection in her car window, her hand stayed firmly on the gas pedal. Assess the situation, stay calm, her military training kicked in automatically. Rogue, the leader, disembarked his bike with the air of a seasoned haughty braggart. His icy gaze was fixated on her as he wore a leather vest with patches that betrayed his history of aggression and intimidation. So, what exactly is this? The sound of Rogue's voice echoed around the lot, evoking laughter from his companions. Is Grandma going for a drive in the morning? Lizzy maintained an expressionless calm as she continued to fill her tank. Much worse had befallen her over her lifetime. She had learned from her experiences in the Vietnamese woods that true danger seldom made such a grand entrance. There's no need for trouble, I'm just getting gas, she said evenly. A towering figure sporting a wild beard approached from behind. The shimmer of her license plate holder attracted his attention. You heard that, Rogue? It's a veteran of the Vietnam War. That old woman says she's a veterinarian. The sound of Rogue's laughing was rude and derogatory. Was she a female veteran? Hey there, dear. How was your time in Nam? The actual warriors deserve coffee, right? Lizzy kept her expression the same even though the words hit her deeply. No one could ever know the innumerable nights she had spent gliding under enemy fire, the hundreds of troops she had rescued from certain death, or the medals that slept in a chest within her wardrobe. A simple, "I served my country," was her response as she changed the petrol pump. As Rogue advanced, the sound of his boots rubbing across the pavement increased. Had military service? Listen, old lady, I have something to tell you about service. So far, dinner is all you've offered. A loose circle was formed around her automobile while the other gang members dispersed. Within the station, Jimmy had vanished, his face turning pale as he extended his hand for the phone. Though Lizzy suspected he was contacting the authorities, she was also aware that their arrival would be too late to make a difference. Moving along would be a good idea, Rogue said, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. This place no longer suits your preferences. Duskwood is presently owned by the Midnight Serpents. Lizzy stood tall, her unflinching gaze locking with Rogue's. Young man, I've faced things that would make your little gang run crying home to mama. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend. She moved to open her car door, but one of the gang members slammed it shut. The sound echoed across the lot like a gunshot. Lizzy's heart rate didn't even flutter. She'd heard real gunshots, felt the heat of real explosions. Maybe you didn't hear me clearly. Rogue leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. This is our town now, and in our town, you show respect. Lizzy's voice remained steady as she replied, respect is earned, son, and so far all I see are boys playing at being men. The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment, the only sound was the idle rumble of motorcycle engines. Then Rogue's face twisted into something ugly, something dangerous. His hands shot out, grabbing Lizzy's arm with bruising force. You want to learn about respect? We'll teach you all about respect. As his fingers dug into her arm, Lizzy's mind flashed back to a night in '68 when she'd pulled a young soldier from the burning wreckage of his helicopter. That soldier had grown up to become Colonel Jack, Steel Jack Morrison, now the leader of the largest veteran motorcycle club in the state. The same Jack Morrison who had told her, if you ever need anything, Lizzy, anything at all, you just call. She hadn't needed to make that call in all these years, but as she looked into Rogue's eyes, seeing the cruelty there, she knew that was about to change. The Midnight Serpents had no idea what they'd just started, but they were about to learn a lesson about real strength, real courage, and real respect. And it would begin with a single phone call. Rogue's grip on Lizzy's arm tightened as his gang circled closer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gas station's cracked pavement, turning the scene into a dark tableau of intimidation. But Lizzy Winters hadn't survived Vietnam by giving in to bullies. Take your hand off me, she said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used to command helicopter crews through enemy fire. Now. Something in her voice made Rogue hesitate for just a moment. His fingers loosened slightly, but his sneer remained fixed. Or what, Grandma? You'll tell on us? I don't make threats, Lizzy replied, carefully extracting her arm from his grip. I never have, but I promise you, son, you're making a mistake. One of the other gang members, a younger man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, laughed harshly. Hear that, Rogue? The old lady's making promises. Lizzy used their moment of amusement to slide into her car, her movements deliberate and controlled. Through the windshield, she could see Jimmy inside the station, still on the phone, his face tight with worry. She knew the local police wouldn't do much. The Midnight Serpents had been terrorizing Duskwood for months now, and law enforcement seemed powerless to stop them. You're not going anywhere, Rogue declared, placing his hand on her car hood. Not until we teach you about respect. Respect? Lizzy started her engine, the familiar rumble of her old Taurus bringing comfort. Let me tell you something about respect. I earned mine pulling men twice your size out of burning helicopters while bullets flew past my head. What have you done besides terrorize innocent people? Her words struck a nerve. Rogue's face darkened, and he signaled to his gang. Within moments, they had surrounded her car with their motorcycles, blocking her exit from every angle. Get out of the car, Rogue demanded. Now. Instead of complying, Lizzy reached for her phone. The action made several gang members tense up, expecting a call to the police. But Lizzy wasn't calling the authorities. Not yet. You want to see what real respect looks like? She asked, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Just wait. Rogue laughed, the sound echoing off the gas station's metal roof. Oh, I get it. You're calling for help. Maybe your grandkids. The police? Go ahead. Call whoever you want. We'll still be here. Lizzie's mind flashed back to a particularly harrowing night in Vietnam. The rain had been coming down in sheets, visibility near zero, but she'd heard the distress call. A squad was pinned down, taking heavy fire. Among them was a young lieutenant named Jack Morrison. She'd flown in blind, using nothing but instinct and skill, and pulled them all out alive. "You boys ever hear of the Veterans Guard?" she asked, her finger pressing the first number. Several of the gang members shifted uncomfortably. The Veterans Guard was well known in biker circles, a motorcycle club composed entirely of combat veterans. Led by the legendary Steel Jack Morrison. They weren't just any biker group. They were organized, disciplined, and commanded respect, even from the most hardened outlaws. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's that got to do with anything?" Snake Tattoo asked, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. "Everything," Lizzie replied simply, continuing to dial. "You see, back in '68, there was this young lieutenant. His chopper went down deep in enemy territory. Everyone said it was a suicide mission to go in after him. But I went anyway." The phone began to ring. Rogue's expression flickered between anger and confusion. "That lieutenant," Lizzie continued, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet lot. "His name was Jack Morrison. These days, people call him Steel Jack, and he owes me a favor." The phone connected. A gruff voice answered. "Morrison. Jack. It's Lizzy Winters. Remember that night near Khe Sanh?" There was a pause. Then Steel Jack's voice softened with recognition. "Lizzie? Of course I remember. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you. What's wrong?" Lizzie's eyes locked with Rogue's as she spoke. "I've got some young men here who need a lesson in respect. The Midnight Serpents. They seem to think Duskwood belongs to them now." The change in Steel Jack's voice was immediate, turning to Steel. "Where are you? Mike's gas and go. Take your time coming over. These boys aren't going anywhere." As she ended the call, the atmosphere in the lot had shifted. Several of the gang members were looking for her. They were looking at each other nervously. The Midnight Serpents might rule Duskwood through fear, but the Veterans Guard was something else entirely. Rogue tried to maintain his composure, but Lizzie could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "You're bluffing. Steel Jack wouldn't come running just because some old woman called." "You sure about that?" Lizzie asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Want to stick around and find out?" In the distance, the distinct rumble of approaching motorcycles began to fill the air. It wasn't the chaotic roar of the Midnight Serpents' bikes. This was different. This was the synchronized rumble of a disciplined unit, moving as one. Rogue's face paled slightly as the sound grew louder. "Mount up," he barked to his gang, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're not done here, old woman. Not by a long shot." The Midnight Serpents scrambled onto their bikes, engines roaring to life. As they peeled out of the lot, Rogue pointed at Lizzie, his fingers shaking slightly. "This isn't over. You've just made things worse for yourself." Lizzie watched them go, her expression calm. She knew they'd be back. Bullies always came back. But now the rules had changed. As the sound of the Veterans Guard grew closer, she allowed herself a small smile. The Midnight Serpents were about to learn what real strength looked like, and the lesson was just beginning. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning away the last traces of dawn. In its light, Lizzie could see the first bikes of the Veterans Guard appearing on the horizon, their chrome gleaming like armor. The real story was about to begin. The Veterans Guard arrived like thunder, their bikes moving in perfect formation as they poured into the gas station lot. 50 riders strong, each one a combat veteran, their leather vests adorned with military patches and unit insignias. At their head rode Colonel Jack, Steel Jack Morrison, his silver hair catching the morning light, his presence commanding respect without a word being spoken. Jimmy, the gas station attendant, watched wide-eyed from behind the glass as the veterans filled his lot. These weren't the chaotic, undisciplined riders he was used to seeing. These men moved with military precision, their bikes arranging themselves in a defensive perimeter around Lizzy's Taurus. Steel Jack dismounted first, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered face marked by time and experience. His eyes, sharp as ever, immediately found Lizzy. A smile broke through his stern expression as he approached her. "Been a long time, Captain Winters," he said, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. "Too long, Jack," Lizzy replied, straightening instinctively. "Old habits died hard, though I wish the reunion was under better circumstances." Steel Jack's expression hardened as he glanced in the direction the Midnight Serpents had fled. "Tell me everything." As Lizzy recounted the morning's events, more veterans gathered around, their faces growing darker with each detail. These men understood respect. They'd earned it the hard way, in jungles and deserts, watching their brothers fall and rise together. "The Midnight Serpents," one of the veterans spat, "they've been causing trouble up and down the coast. Time someone taught them a lesson." Steel Jack raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "Lizzy here taught me something important back in '68. You remember what you told me that night, Captain? When everyone else said the mission was impossible." Lizzy smiled slightly. "I told you that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified." "That's right," Jack nodded. "And you showed us what that meant when you flew into that hot zone. Lost count of how many rounds hit your chopper that night." One of the younger veterans stepped forward, his eyes wide with recognition. "Wait, this is the Angel of Kaysen. The pilot who saved the entire 5th platoon." "The one and only," Jack confirmed. Though she never did like that nickname, Lizzy waved away the title. "There were dozens of pilots braver than me. I just did what needed doing." "Just did what needed doing," Jack echoed with a laugh. "She says that like it was nothing. Boys, this woman flew into the teeth of enemy fire more times than anyone could count. Saved my life and the lives of countless others. And now some punk gang thinks they can intimidate her." The veterans' faces hardened with resolve. These men understood debt, understood loyalty. Each of them had served, had known the terror of combat, and the brotherhood it forged. "The Midnight Serpents will be back," Lizzy said, her voice steady. "They're not the type to let this go." "Let them come," Jack replied, his tone grim. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Tell me about their leader, this rogue." As Lizzy described the gang's leader, Steel Jack's expression grew increasingly concerned. He recognized the type, a bully who'd never faced real resistance, who confused fear with respect. "They've been terrorizing Duskwood for months," Jimmy added from nearby, finally brave enough to join the conversation. "Police can't, or won't, do anything about it." Steel Jack nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "Lizzy, you've got a VA meeting to attend, don't you?" "Yes, but under the circumstances, you'll attend," Jack cut her off with a smile. "Just like any other day, but you won't be going alone." He turned to his men, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had led them through combat. "Alpha Team, you're on escort duty. Beta and Charlie, start patrols. I want eyes on every corner of Duskwood. The Midnight Serpents want to play games. Let's show them how veterans handle business." The veterans moved with practiced efficiency, breaking into their assigned groups. Steel Jack turned back to Lizzy, his expression softening. "We'll handle this, Captain. The old way." Lizzy looked at the assembled veterans, men who understood sacrifice and honor in ways the Midnight Serpents never could. "Just try not to destroy the town in the process, Jack. Duskwood's been my home for 40 years. No promises, Jack grinned, but his eyes were serious. But these boys need to learn that respect isn't taken, it's earned, and they're about to get one hell of a lesson. As the veterans mounted their bikes, preparing to escort Lizzy to her meeting, she couldn't help but remember another time, another place, when these same men had been young soldiers fighting for their lives. Now they were here, ready to fight again. Not for country this time, but for something just as important, the right to live without fear. The morning had started with intimidation from the Midnight Serpents. Now, as the Veterans Guard's engines roared to life, it was about to become something else entirely. The war for Duskwood's soul was about to begin, and Lizzy Winters, despite her 90 years, found herself once again at the center of the storm. Steel Jack's voice carried over the rumble of engines. "Just like old times, Captain." Lizzy smiled as she got into her car, the veterans forming up around her. "Just like old times, Lieutenant. Just like old times." The convoy pulled out of the gas station, a display of power and discipline that couldn't have been more different from the Midnight Serpent's chaotic presence. In its wake, Jimmy stood watching, a smile spreading across his face. Something was changing in Duskwood, and for the first time in months, it felt like change for the better. Across town, in an abandoned warehouse that served as the Midnight Serpent's clubhouse, Rogue paced the oil-stained floor. His boots echoed against the concrete as his gang watched nervously. The morning's encounter had shaken their usual confidence, though none would admit it openly. The Veterans Guard, Rogue's bat, kicking an empty beer can across the floor. "That old woman knows Steel Jack Morrison. Of all the people in this worthless town, we had to pick her." Snake Tattoo leaned against his bike, trying to maintain his tough exterior. "So what? They're just another MC. We've dealt with rival clubs before." One of the older members, a man called Axel, shook his head. "No, these guys are different. They're not just bikers. They're combat vets. Organized. Disciplined. They've seen real war. We've seen plenty of action," Rogue growled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "Not like them," Axel insisted. "I heard stories about Steel Jack. He runs the Veterans Guard like a military unit. And that woman, if she really is the pilot they see, the Angel of Key San. I don't care if she's the Queen of England," Rogue exploded, his fist slamming into a nearby locker. "This is our town now. We can't let some old woman and her veteran friends push us around. We'll lose everything we've built here." Meanwhile, Lizzy's convoy arrived at the VA center. The Veterans Guard's bikes forming a protective perimeter around the parking lot. As she stepped out of her car, several veterans who'd been waiting for the meeting came out to greet her, their eyes wide at the impressive escort. "Quite an entrance, Lizzy," smiled Rachel Chen, a Gulf War veteran who ran the VA support group. "Though I hear you've had quite a morning." "Word travels fast," Lizzy observed, straightening her cardigan. "Hard to miss 50 Veterans Guard bikes rolling through town," Rachel replied. "Want to tell us what happened?" Inside the VA center, as the meeting began, Lizzy shared the morning's events. The room was packed with veterans of various ages, from Vietnam era to recent conflicts. Their reactions ranged from anger to grim determination, as they heard how the Midnight Serpents had treated one of their own. "I remembered something this morning," Lizzy said. Her voice carrying across the quiet room. "Something from my last mission in Vietnam. We were pulling out a group of Marines under heavy fire. The helicopter was taking hits, hydraulics were failing, but we couldn't leave those boys behind." The room was silent, everyone leaning in to listen. Even the Veterans Guard members stationed outside had come in to hear her story. One of the young Marines asked me later why I came back for them when everyone else said it was too risky. I told him something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the biggest act of courage is standing up for others when everyone else looks away. Steel Jack, standing at the back of the room, nodded slowly. That's what we're doing now, Lizzy. Standing up for Duskwood. But before anyone could respond, the distant roar of motorcycles filled the air. Through the windows, they could see clouds of dust rising from the road leading to the VA center. The Midnight Serpents were returning, and this time they'd brought reinforcements. Looks like Rogue called in some friends, Steel Jack observed grimly, counting the approaching bikes. At least 30 more riders. Lizzy stood, her movement drawing every eye in the room. Jack, I won't have violence at the VA center. These people come here for healing, not fighting. Agreed, Steel Jack replied, already moving toward the door. Delta team, escort our veterans out the back entrance. Everyone else, mount up. We're taking this somewhere else. The Veterans Guard moved with tactical precision, helping the VA meeting attendees to safety while preparing for confrontation. Lizzy watched as Rachel Chen efficiently organized the evacuation, proving that military training never really faded. Outside, the Midnight Serpents and their reinforcements lined up across the street from the VA center. Their bikes forming an intimidating wall of chrome and steel. Rogue sat at the center, his face twisted with anger and wounded pride. Come on out, old woman, he shouted, his voice carrying across the parking lot. You and your veteran friends can't hide in there forever. Steel Jack stepped out first, his presence commanding attention. Behind him, the Veterans Guard took positions, their formation precise and threatening. Lizzy emerged last, her head held high, showing no fear. Son, she called out to Rogue, her voice clear and steady. You're making a mistake. This isn't about pride or territory. This is about right and wrong. Stand down before someone gets hurt. Rogue's response was cut off by the sudden arrival of police sirens. 3 patrol cars screamed into the parking lot, lights flashing. Chief Roberts, a Vietnam-era Marine himself, stepped out of the lead car. Nobody's fighting at my VA center, he announced, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. Rogue, you and your boys need to leave, now. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Rogue looked from the police to the Veterans Guard, then to Lizzy, his face a mask of fury and frustration. Finally, he kicked his bike to life. This isn't over, he snarled, not by a long shot. As the Midnight Serpents reluctantly withdrew, their reinforcements following, Steel Jack turned to Lizzy. He's right about one thing. This isn't over. Lizzy watched the dust clouds fade on the horizon, her expression thoughtful. No, it's not. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. Chief Roberts approached them, holstering his weapon. Lizzy, Jack, we need to talk. The Midnight Serpents have been a problem for months, but now they're desperate and desperate men do desperate things. The morning sun had reached its peak, casting harsh shadows across the VA center parking lot. As Lizzy looked at the assembled faces, police, veterans, friends, she knew that Duskwood was about to change. The only question was, would it be for better or worse? The war for the soul of their town was just beginning, and she was once again in the pilot's seat. Just like in Vietnam, lives hung in the balance. But this time, the enemy wasn't hiding in the jungle. They were right here in plain sight, and they weren't going anywhere. Chief Roberts led Lizzy, Steel Jack, and several senior Veterans Guard members into the VA Center's conference room. The blinds were drawn, casting striped shadows across the wooden table where they gathered. Outside, the remaining Guard members maintained their vigilant patrol of the perimeter. Let me be direct, Roberts began, spreading a map of Duskwood across the table. The Midnight Serpents have been systematically taking over this town. They started with protection rackets on 3rd Street, then moved to intimidating business owners in the historic district. Now they've got half the town terrified to speak out. Steel Jack leaned forward, his fingers tracing the marked locations. How many are we dealing with? Core group is about 25, Roberts replied. But after today's show, rogues called in favors. We're looking at maybe 75 riders total, spread across 3 affiliated gangs. Lizzy studied the map quietly, her mind working with the same tactical precision that had kept her alive during countless missions. They're not just causing trouble randomly. There's a pattern here. She pointed to several locations. Look, they've established presence along every major route in and out of Duskwood. They're not just terrorizing the town, they're controlling it. Smart observation, Roberts nodded. But that's not the worst of it. We've got intel suggesting they're moving into drug trafficking, using Duskwood as a distribution hub. Steel Jack's face darkened. Not anymore, they're not. Easy, Jack, Lizzy cautioned. We need to be smarter than them. Tell me, Chief, why haven't you moved against them before now? Robert's expression turned bitter. Politics. The mayor's office is worried about escalation. Plus, we've got reason to believe someone in City Hall is on their payroll. Meanwhile, across town in the Midnight Serpents warehouse, Rogue was holding his own council of war. The reinforcements had brought not just numbers, but experience. Hardened riders who'd dealt with rival gangs before. The Veterans Guard is different, a rider from one of the allied gangs warned. They've got military training, discipline. They're not your typical MC. Rogue slammed his fist on the table. I don't care what they are. This is about respect. That old woman humiliated us in front of the whole town. We let this stand, we might as well pack up and leave. Maybe we should, Axel suggested carefully. Find easier territory. The suggestion earned him a violent shove from Rogue. This isn't about territory anymore. This is personal. That woman, those veterans, they think they're better than us. Think they can just waltz in and take what's ours. Back at the VA center, the strategy session continued. Rachel Chen had joined them, bringing coffee and her own military intelligence background. We need to understand what we're really fighting for, Lizzy said, her voice drawing everyone's attention. This isn't about territory or pride. It's about the soul of Duskwood. She stood, moving to the window. I've lived here 40 years. Watched children grow up, families put down roots. The Midnight Serpents aren't just threatening our safety. They're threatening our way of life. Steeljack nodded slowly. You're right. But how do we fight them without turning Duskwood into a war zone? The same way I fought in Vietnam, Lizzy replied, turning back to face them. With precision, intelligence, and by choosing our battles carefully. She returned to the map, pointing to specific locations. They've made themselves look strong by spreading fear. But spread too thin, even the strongest force becomes vulnerable. Chief Roberts leaned forward, intrigued. What are you suggesting? We start with the businesses they're extorting, Lizzy explained. The Veterans Guard provides protection, shows the town they're not alone. Meanwhile, we gather evidence of their drug operation. Real evidence that even City Hall can't ignore. They won't take that lying down, Rachel warned. No, Lizzy agreed. They won't, which is exactly what we're counting on. When people get angry, they get sloppy, make mistakes. Steeljack smiled grimly. Just like that night in Key San. Draw them in, make them commit their forces, then hit them where they're weakest. Exactly, Lizzy nodded. But this time, we're not fighting with bullets. We're fighting for hearts and minds. Show Duskwood that there's still good people willing to stand up to bullies. Robert scratched his chin thoughtfully. It could work, but it's risky. The Midnight Serpents will retaliate. Of course they will, Lizzy said calmly. But this time, we'll be ready. And this time, they'll learn what real strength looks like. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across Duskwood. In houses and shops across town, people watched and waited, wondering what would come next. The arrival of the Veterans Guard had given them something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. Steel Jack stood, his decision made. "All right, Lizzy. We'll do this your way. But I want you protected at all times. Rogue's the type to take this personally." Lizzy smiled slightly. "Jack, I've been shot at by better men than Rogue. But I appreciate the concern." As the meeting concluded and plans were set in motion, Rachel pulled Lizzy aside. "You know what you're starting here, don't you? This could change everything." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Lizzy replied, her eyes steady with determination. "Sometimes things need to change. Sometimes they need to be forced to change." The war for Duskwood was about to enter a new phase. Not with violence and chaos, but with strategy and purpose. Just as she had in Vietnam, Lizzy Winters was about to teach another lesson about courage, respect, and the true meaning of strength. And this time the whole town would be watching. Dawn broke over Duskwood's historic district, painting the old brick buildings in shades of gold. The street was quiet except for the steady rumble of motorcycles. Not the chaotic roar of the Midnight Serpents, but the disciplined hum of Veterans Guard bikes positioned at strategic points along 3rd Street. Inside Mason's Hardware, the oldest store in Duskwood, Tom Mason was having his first peaceful morning in months. His hands shook slightly as he counted out his register drawer, not from fear this time, but from relief. "They usually show up by now," he told the 2 Veterans Guard members stationed inside his store. "Every morning, like clockwork, demanding their protection money." One of the veterans, a former Army Ranger named Mike, nodded grimly. "Not today, they won't." Lizzy sat in her usual booth at Diana's diner across the street, sipping coffee and watching the scene unfold. Steel Jack sat across from her, his own coffee untouched. "They'll test us," he said quietly. "Probably today." "I'm counting on it," Lizzy replied, eyes scanning the street. Rogue's not the type to back down easily. His pride won't let him. As if on cue, the distant sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. The Midnight Serpents appeared at the end of 3rd Street, their bikes gleaming in the morning light. Rogue led the pack, but he pulled up short when he saw the Veterans Guard positions. "Right on schedule," Lizzy murmured, setting down her coffee cup. The Midnight Serpents idled their bikes, clearly unsure how to proceed. The Veterans Guard members didn't move, didn't react. They simply watched, their presence a clear message. Rogue revved his engine angrily and dismounted, storming toward Mason's Hardware. 2 Veterans Guard members stepped out to meet him, their posture relaxed but ready. "This is private property," Mike said calmly. "Mr. Mason isn't interested in your kind of protection anymore. Is that right?" Rogue snarled, his face reddening. "Why don't we ask Tom himself?" Inside the diner, Steel Jack started to rise, but Lizzy placed a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Watch what happens." Tom Mason emerged from his store, standing straight for the first time in months. Behind him, more veterans appeared, a solid wall of support. "You heard them, Rogue." Tom's voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. "We don't need your protection. We've got real veterans watching over us now." Rogue's hand twitched toward his jacket, but he froze when he saw how many Veterans Guard members had materialized around him. They hadn't drawn weapons, hadn't made threats. They simply stood there, their presence an unmistakable warning. "This isn't over, old man," Rogue spat at Tom. "None of this is over." He turned, his eyes finding Lizzy through the diner window. Their gazes locked, and Lizzy saw something dangerous flash across his face. Wounded pride mixed with murderous rage. "You did this," he shouted, pointing at her. "You think you can just walk in and turn everyone against us? We built something here." Lizzy stood slowly, walking to the diner's door. Every eye on the street followed her movement as she stepped outside. "What exactly did you build, son?" Her voice was steady, carrying to every ear. "Fear. Intimidation. That's not building." That's destroying. Other business owners had emerged from their shops now, watching the confrontation. The Midnight Serpents shifted uneasily on their bikes, outnumbered and outmatched by the Veterans Guard's disciplined presence. You don't understand anything. Rogue's voice shook with rage. This town was dead before we came. We made it strong. No, Lizzy replied, taking another step forward. You made it afraid. There's a difference. She gestured to the veterans around them. These men and women. They know what real strength is. They've fought real battles, not just bullied innocent people. They understand something you never have. Respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through actions. Rogue's face contorted with fury. He took a step toward Lizzy, but instantly found his path blocked by Steel Jack and 3 other veterans. Think carefully about your next move, son. Steel Jack's voice was soft, but carried an edge of steel. Very carefully. For a long moment, tension crackled through the air. Then Rogue backed away, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. This is our town. He snarled, mounting his bike. You want a war? You've got one. The Midnight Serpents roared away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and threats. As their noise faded, the street remained silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, someone started to clap. Others joined in. The sound building as business owners and residents emerged fully from their shops. Tom Mason approached Lizzy, tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said simply. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to them. We were afraid. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Lizzy assured him. But this isn't over. Rogue will be back, and he'll be looking for revenge. Steel Jack joined them, his expression serious. We've won the first battle. But you're right. This is just the beginning. He'll hit back hard, try to make an example. Let him try, Lizzy replied, watching the gathering crowd of townspeople. Every move he makes now just shows Duskwood who he really is. And who we really are. Rachel Chen arrived, slightly out of breath. Just got word. The Midnight Serpents are gathering at their warehouse, calling in more reinforcements. Lizzy nodded, unsurprised. Good, let them come. The more forces they commit, the more vulnerable they become. She turned to address the gathered veterans and townspeople. Today we showed them that Duskwood isn't afraid anymore. But tomorrow, they'll try to remind us why we should be. We need to be ready. The sun had risen fully now, washing the street in bright light. The shadow of fear that had hung over Duskwood was lifting. But everyone knew. The real storm was still coming. Rogue and his gang wouldn't go quietly, wouldn't accept defeat easily. But looking at the faces around her, veterans standing tall, townspeople finding their courage, Lizzy knew they had already won something important. They had given Duskwood back its dignity, its spirit. Now they just had to keep it. Night fell over Duskwood like a velvet curtain, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The Veterans Guard maintained their patrols, their bikes moving silently through the darkened streets. In the 2 days since the confrontation on 3rd Street, tension had built like a thunderhead before a storm. Lizzy sat in her living room, reviewing reports from different Veterans Guard units. Rachel Chen had set up a makeshift command center in her kitchen, complete with radio communications, and a detailed map of Duskwood marked with Shadow Viper's known locations. Movement at the warehouse, Rachel's voice crackled over the radio. Large group heading out, at least 30 bikes. Steel Jack's response came quickly. All units, maintain positions. Let's see what they're planning. Lizzy moved to her window, drawing the curtain back slightly. 2 veterans were parked across the street, their bikes dark and silent. She knew there were more nearby, hidden in strategic positions throughout her neighborhood. The quiet shattered with the sound of breaking glass. Fire at Mason's Hardware, a voice shouted over the radio. Multiple perpetrators moving fast. Before anyone could respond, another report cut in. Molotov cocktail at Diana's diner. They're hitting multiple targets. Steel Jack's voice remained steady. All units converge on downtown. Protection teams stay with assigned locations. This is what we trained for. Lizzie was already moving, grabbing her car keys. Rachel stepped in her path, shaking her head. You're their primary target, Lizzie. You need to stay secure. Those are my friends out there, Lizzie replied, her voice firm. I started this. I won't hide while they suffer for it. The radio crackled again. They're targeting veteran-owned businesses. Pete's auto shop is burning. Rachel and Lizzie shared a look. This wasn't random violence. The Midnight Serpents were sending a message. Outside, the night sky had taken on an orange glow as multiple fires burned across Duskwood. The sound of sirens mixed with motorcycle engines as both police and Veterans Guard responded to the attacks. Let me through, Lizzie demanded. And this time Rachel didn't argue. They rushed to Lizzie's car, accompanied by their security detail. Downtown Duskwood had become a battlefield. The Midnight Serpents struck fast and coordinated, hitting businesses that had dared to stand up to them. Fire trucks were already on scene at Mason's Hardware, where Tom Mason stood watching his family's legacy burn. They knew exactly when to hit, Steel Jack said as Lizzie approached. Had to have inside information about patrol patterns. Your mole in City Hall, Lizzie nodded grimly. They're trying to show the town what happens when people resist. Nearby, Diana's diner had suffered less damage thanks to quick action by Veterans Guard members who'd been inside. Diana herself, a tough woman in her 60s, was helping direct firefighters while cursing colorfully about the Midnight Serpents. Chief Roberts is coordinating with state police, Rachel reported, checking her phone. But Rogue's gang is staying just ahead of them, hitting and running. A motorcycle roared past, its rider laughing as he threw another Molotov cocktail. Before it could hit its target, a Veterans Guard rider intercepted, knocking the explosive device away. It shattered harmlessly in the street. This is just the beginning, Steel Jack warned, watching the flames reflect off nearby windows. Rogue's showing us what he's willing to do. Next time will be worse. As if to confirm his words, a new voice cut through their radios. They're at the VA center. Multiple hostiles armed. Lizzie's blood ran cold. The VA center wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary for veterans dealing with the scars of war, both visible and invisible. That's crossing a line, Steel Jack growled, already moving toward his bike. Wait, Lizzie called out. That's what they want, to draw our forces thin, make us react emotionally. She turned to address the gathered veterans and townspeople. This isn't about property damage. Rogues trying to break our spirit, make us feel helpless again. Tom Mason stepped forward. His face streaked with soot. What do we do then? Just let them burn our town down. No, Lizzie replied, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. We show them that fire hardens steel. It doesn't destroy it. She looked at the gathering crowd. Veterans, business owners, residents who'd lived in fear for too long. In their faces, she saw not defeat, but determination. Rogue thinks he can break us by breaking our things, she continued. But Duskwood isn't about buildings. It's about people. And people, when they stand together, are stronger than any gang. As if to punctuate her words, more townspeople began arriving, bringing water, supplies, and offers of help. The Midnight Serpents had meant to demonstrate their power, but they'd inadvertently revealed something else. The true strength of community. Rachel, Lizzie turned to her friend. Contact every business owner in town. Tell them we're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. It's time. Duskwood showed Rogue what real strength looks like. Steel Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. You're thinking about Operation Rolling Thunder. Something like that. Lizzy smiled grimly. But this time, we're not just fighting for territory. We're fighting for home. The fires continued to burn, but they illuminated more than destruction. They showed neighbors helping neighbors, veterans standing guard, and a town finally ready to fight back. The Midnight Serpents had wanted to break Duskwood's spirit. Instead, they'd forged it stronger. As dawn approached, Lizzy stood in front of the damaged VA center, watching volunteers already beginning repairs. The night's attacks had been meant to demoralize them. But looking at the determined faces around her, she knew Rogue had made a critical mistake. He'd shown his hand too early, played his cards too aggressively. Now it was their turn. And Lizzy Winters had learned a thing or two about strategy in her 90 years. The war for Duskwood was entering a new phase. And this time, they would be the ones setting the terms of engagement. The community center was packed by dawn, every seat filled with business owners, residents, and veterans. The air smelled of coffee and determination as Lizzy stood at the podium, surveying the crowd. Behind her, a large map of Duskwood covered the wall, marked with the previous night's attack locations. Last night, the Midnight Serpents showed us what they think power looks like, Lizzy began, her voice steady. Today, we show them what real strength is. Tom Mason stood up, his face still bearing ash smudges from his burned store. How? They've got numbers, weapons, and someone in City Hall feeding them information. Which is exactly why we're going to win, Lizzy replied, a slight smile crossing her face. Because they think those things make them strong. But I learned something in Vietnam that Rogue never will. True strength isn't about how much damage you can do, it's about how much you can take and still keep fighting. Steel Jack stepped forward, unfolding a document. We've got the deed to the old factory on River Street. The Veterans Guard just bought it, legally and officially. As of this morning, it's our new headquarters. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The factory sat at a strategic crossroads, overlooking much of downtown Duskwood. But that's not all, Lizzy continued. Every business they attacked last night, we're going to rebuild them. Not one at a time, all of them, today. Diana from the diner stood up. How? Most of us don't have insurance that covers gang violence. You don't need it, Rachel Chen announced, stepping up beside Lizzy. The Veterans Guard has established a community restoration fund. Every member has contributed. We've got enough to rebuild every damaged business and then some. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Steel Jack raised his hand for quiet. That's phase 1, he said. Phase 2 is making sure it doesn't happen again. Lizzy pointed to the map. The Midnight Serpents think they can control Duskwood through fear. But they've got a weakness. They need the town's infrastructure to operate. They need gas stations for their bikes. Restaurants for their meetings. Streets for their travel. She turned to the crowd, her eyes bright with strategic fire. Starting today, every business in Duskwood operates under new rules. Veterans Guard members will train your employees in security protocols. We'll install panic buttons, surveillance systems, and emergency response plans. What about their inside source? Someone called out. The mole in City Hall. Already handled, Chief Roberts spoke up from the back. We fed them false patrol routes last night. The information they got. We wanted them to have it. Now we know exactly how they're getting their intelligence. A spark of hope began to spread through the room. Lizzy could see it in their faces. The realization that they weren't helpless anymore. Here's what happens next, she continued. Every business they attacked reopens by sunset. We work together. Veterans, residents, everyone. Show them that they can't shut us down. Can't break our spirit. Tom Mason stood again. My store. It's pretty bad, Lizzy. Sunset's awful soon. You'll have help, Steel Jack assured him. Half the Veterans Guard are skilled craftsmen. The other half? Well, we're pretty good at following orders and getting things done. Rachel stepped forward with a stack of papers. We've divided the town into sectors. Each sector has a veteran coordinator and a civilian liaison. Everything's organized. Everything's planned. All we need now is you. The room was silent for a moment as the magnitude of what they were proposing sank in. Then Diana stood up. Well, what are we waiting for? My diner's not going to rebuild itself. The meeting transformed into an organizing session. People grouped by sectors, receiving assignments and coordinating resources. The Veterans Guard distributed radios and security equipment while Rachel's team handed out detailed restoration plans. Lizzie watched it all from the podium, remembering another time, another place where she'd seen people come together in the face of adversity. Rogue had tried to break them, but he'd only succeeded in uniting them. Outside, the sound of construction had already begun. Veterans Guard members were removing burned materials from Mason's hardware while local contractors delivered fresh supplies. The street was filled with people carrying lumber, tools, and hope. You know Rogue won't take this lying down, Steel Jack said quietly, joining Lizzie at the podium. I'm counting on it, she replied. But this time, when he strikes, he won't be hitting isolated targets. He'll be facing a united front. Rachel approached with a radio update. We've got Midnight Serpents watching from the edges of town. They're seeing everything. Good, Lizzie nodded. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when they try to break something that refuses to be broken. As the sun climbed higher, Duskwood transformed into a hive of activity. Veterans worked alongside civilians, businesses helped other businesses, and the community that Rogue had tried to terrorize into submission showed its true face, one of resilience, unity, and determination. By mid-afternoon, Mason's hardware had a new roof. Diana's diner was serving free coffee to workers from a makeshift counter. The VA center's damages were already repaired, and more improvements were being added. Lizzie stood in the street, watching her plan unfold. The Midnight Serpents had tried to burn Duskwood's spirit. Instead, they'd ignited something else. Something that no amount of violence could extinguish. The war wasn't over. But the rules had changed, and Rogue was about to learn a lesson about real power that he'd never forget. The Midnight Serpents warehouse vibrated with tension as Rogue watched the surveillance footage on a laptop screen. His knuckles whitened around the beer bottle in his hand as he observed the transformation taking place in downtown Duskwood. They rebuilt everything, Snake Tattoo said incredulously. In one day, like we never even touched it. Not everything, Rogue growled. They did more than rebuild. Look closer. The footage showed the subtle but significant changes. New security cameras on every corner. Reinforced doors on businesses. Veterans Guard members training store owners in defensive tactics. What had been a vulnerable town was rapidly becoming a fortress. They're organized, Axel observed quietly. Military precision. This isn't just repair work. It's fortification. Rogue hurled his beer bottle against the wall, glass shattering. That old woman. She's not just fighting back. She's changing the whole game. The warehouse door opened and a city hall clerk, their inside source, hurried in. His face was pale with worry. We've got bigger problems, he announced. The Veterans Guard just filed paperwork for official security contracts with 20 major businesses in town. They're going legitimate, licensed, bonded, insured. They're taking our protection racket, Snake Tattoo realized. Legally, Rogue's face darkened. What about the police patrols? The routes I paid you for? The clerk shook his head. They fed me bad information. Chief Roberts knows there's a leak. I can't risk passing anything else without exposing myself. Meanwhile, at the newly established Veterans Guard headquarters in the old factory, Lizzy stood reviewing security feeds from across town. The installation of the surveillance network had been Rachel's idea. A way to protect the town while gathering evidence of any Midnight Serpents activities. "They're getting desperate," Steel Jack noted, watching Rogue's gang members prowling the outskirts of town. "Lost their income. Lost their intelligence network. Lost their fear factor." "Desperate men are dangerous men," Lizzy replied, remembering lessons learned hard in Vietnam. "Rogue's got too much pride to back down. He'll try something big." Rachel entered with a tablet displaying financial records. "You were right about following the money. The Midnight Serpents have been running more than just protection rackets. They've got drug supply lines running through 3 states, using Duskwood as a distribution hub. That's federal territory." Chief Roberts commented from his position near the door. "DEA would be very interested in this information." "Not yet," Lizzy said, studying the data. "We need to let them think they still have that option. Push them too hard, too fast, and they might do something truly desperate." The radio crackled with a report from a patrol unit. "Multiple vehicles entering town from the north. These aren't bikes, heavy trucks, at least 4 of them." Steel Jack moved to the window, raising binoculars. "Looks like Rogue's called in his supplier connections. Those aren't local boys." Lizzy watched the trucks through the surveillance network, noting their military-style precision. "Cartel involvement?" "Likely," Rachel confirmed, checking her files. "The Serpents have been middlemaning between major suppliers and local distribution. If they lose Duskwood, they lose everything." Lizzy finished. She turned to address the room. "This just became about more than just our town. Rogues brought in players who won't care about collateral damage." Outside, the trucks split up, taking different routes through town. Veterans Guard patrols maintained discreet surveillance, reporting their movements. "They're setting up new safe houses," Steel Jack observed, "spreading out their operations so we can't hit them all at once." "No," Lizzy corrected, seeing the pattern. "They're surrounding us, creating a perimeter. This isn't just about drugs anymore. They're preparing for war." Chief Roberts checked his sidearm. "I should call in state police." "Not yet," Lizzy insisted. "The moment this becomes official, people will get hurt. We need to handle this our way first." She moved to the map, marking the truck's positions. "Rogue's trying to show us he's got powerful friends, but he's also shown us something else. He's scared. He wouldn't bring an outside muscle if he thought he could handle this himself." "What's our play?" Steel Jack asked, trusting her tactical judgment as he had in Vietnam. "We let them think they're in control," Lizzy replied, a strategy forming in her mind. "Let them set up their positions, get comfortable. Meanwhile, we gather evidence, track their movements, learn their patterns." Rachel nodded, understanding. "Like tracking VC supply lines." "Exactly," Lizzy confirmed. "But this time, we're not just gathering intelligence for ourselves. Every movement they make, every deal they conduct, we document it all. Build a case so strong that when we do call in the authorities, they won't just get Rogue," Steel Jack finished. "They'll get the whole network." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. They weren't just fighting for Duskwood anymore. They were taking on an entire criminal enterprise. The stakes had risen dramatically. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Lizzy warned. "These new players won't follow any rules. They won't care about collateral damage." "Then we better make sure there isn't any," Steel Jack declared. "I want our patrols doubled. Every business gets additional security. No one in Duskwood stands alone." As the sun set over the town, Lizzy watched the trucks settle into their new positions. Rogue thought he was showing strength by bringing in outside forces. Instead, he'd revealed his weakness and given them the opportunity to do more than just save Duskwood. They could shut down an entire criminal operation. But first, they had to survive what was coming. Because Rogue and his new allies wouldn't go down without a fight. And this time, the battlefield wouldn't just be the streets of Duskwood. It would be anywhere they could hurt the town and its people. The real war was about to begin. A week of uneasy tension gripped Duskwood like a coiled spring. The cartel trucks had established their positions, converting abandoned buildings into fortified outposts. The Midnight Serpents patrolled the streets with newfound arrogance, bolstered by their dangerous allies. Lizzie sat in her living room well past midnight, studying surveillance photos spread across her coffee table. Rachel had installed a secure computer system that kept her connected to the Veterans Guard Command Center. Movement at the North Safe House. Rachel's voice came through the encrypted radio. Large shipment coming in. Steel Jack's response was immediate. Document everything. We're building a case. A gentle knock at Lizzie's door drew her attention. Tom Mason stood there, looking nervous but determined. They approached me today, he said without preamble as Lizzie let him in. Offered to buy the store, 3 times what it's worth. Lizzie's eyes narrowed. They're not just trying to buy your store, Tom. They're trying to buy your silence. I know, he nodded. They're doing it all over town, offering crazy money for strategic locations. Some folks are tempted. Before Lizzie could respond, the radio crackled again. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. These aren't cartel, different signatures. Through her window, Lizzie could see the newcomers. Sleek black SUVs moving with professional precision. Not cartel, not local law enforcement. Private military contractors, Rachel confirmed over the radio. Looks like Rogues called in more than just cartel backup. Steel Jack's voice was grim. These aren't street thugs. These are professional mercenaries. Lizzie watched the SUVs disperse through town, her mind racing. He's escalating. Bringing in trained killers means he's planning something big. At the Midnight Serpents warehouse, Rogue met with the mercenaries' commander. A cold-eyed man who introduced himself simply as Marshall. Your gang war has attracted attention, Marshall stated flatly. My employers want this situation resolved quickly and quietly. This isn't a gang war, Rogue protested. This is about respect, This is about business, Marshall cut him off. The cartel can't afford disruption to their distribution network. You've got 48 hours to resolve this or we resolve it our way. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Rogue's face twisted with rage and fear. What about the old woman? The veterans? Marshall's smile was razor thin. Professional problems require professional solutions. Back at Veterans Guard headquarters, Lizzie called an emergency meeting. The situation had evolved beyond their initial expectations. These contractors change everything, she explained to the assembled leaders. They're not thugs we can intimidate or outlaws we can outmaneuver. They're trained killers for hire. We've got combat experience too, Steeljack reminded her. Yes, but we also have something to lose, Lizzie countered. They don't care about collateral damage. They don't care about Duskwood. Rachel pulled up surveillance footage of the mercenaries setting up positions. They're establishing sniper nests, planning escape routes. This is military-grade tactical preparation. Then we respond in kind, Steeljack declared. Call in our own resources. Lizzie shook her head. That's exactly what they want. An escalation that forces official intervention. The moment this becomes an open conflict, innocent people get caught in the crossfire. So what's the play? Chief Roberts asked, his face showing the strain of recent events. Lizzie moved to the map, her finger tracing patterns only she could see. We let them think they've got us outgunned. Let them get overconfident. Meanwhile, we prepare for their real objective. Which is, Rachel prompted. Me, Lizzie stated simply. All of this, the cartel, the mercenaries, it's because Rogue's pride won't let him back down. He needs to prove. He can break me to save face. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. You're not suggesting, Steeljack began. I'm suggesting we give him what he wants, Lizzy confirmed. A clear shot at me, but on our terms, not his. That's too risky, Rachel protested. These aren't street thugs with bad aim. These are professional killers. Lizzy's smile was slight, but determined. So was the VC sniper who put 3 rounds through my chopper at Kaysen. I'm still here. She turned to address the room. Rogue thinks bringing in professionals gives him the advantage, but professionals follow patterns, stick to protocols. We can use that against them. The strategy session stretched into dawn as they refined their plan. The Veterans Guard would appear to withdraw, reducing their visible presence while actually strengthening their hidden positions. They would let the mercenaries think they were gaining the upper hand. Meanwhile, every movement, every communication, every transaction would be documented. The evidence would build until it became overwhelming. We're not just fighting for Duskwood anymore, Lizzy reminded them. We're fighting for every town these people might target next. As the meeting concluded, Steeljack pulled Lizzy aside. You know, they'll come for you. I'm counting on it, she replied. Sometimes the best way to disarm a trap is to spring it deliberately. The sun rose over Duskwood, casting long shadows from the mercenaries' sniper nests. In the growing light, 2 forces prepared for confrontation, one driven by pride and profit, the other by principle and protection. The next 48 hours would determine not just the fate of a town, but the future of everyone in it. Lizzy Winters had faced death before, had stared it down from the cockpit of a helicopter in Vietnam. Now she would face it again on the streets of the town she'd called home for 40 years. But this time, the stakes were even higher. Because this time, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the soul of Duskwood itself. And she didn't intend to lose. The first sign of trouble came at dawn. The Veterans Guard patrols that had become a familiar sight in Duskwood were suddenly gone, their absence leaving a conspicuous void in the morning streets. To anyone watching, it appeared the veterans had finally backed down. Lizzy walked alone to Diana's diner, her steps measured and unhurried. Through reflected windows, she counted 3 mercenary teams tracking her movement. They were good, professional and subtle, but she'd spent too many years scanning jungle canopy for hidden threats to miss their positions. You shouldn't be out here alone, Diana said as Lizzy took her usual booth. Not with those men watching. That's exactly why I need to be here, Lizzy replied, accepting her usual coffee. Let them watch. Marshall, the mercenaries' commander, observed from a parked SUV down the street. His cold eyes tracked Lizzy's every movement as he spoke into a secure radio. Target is establishing predictable patterns. Moving in the open, unprotected. Either she's gotten careless or it's a trap. Rogue finished, his voice crackling through the radio. That old woman's smarter than she looks. Doesn't matter, Marshall replied. Predictable targets are dead targets, trap or not. At Veterans Guard headquarters, now apparently abandoned, Rachel monitored hidden cameras that covered every angle of the town. Steeljack stood behind her, watching multiple feeds. For sniper teams, Rachel noted, marking positions on a digital map. Plus 3 ground teams disguised as civilians. They're building a killing zone. Just like Lizzy predicted, Steeljack nodded. They're following standard elimination protocols, setting up overlapping fields of fire. Rachel zoomed in on one feed showing Rogue pacing nervously outside his warehouse. He doesn't look happy about bringing in the professionals. He's lost control, Steeljack observed. The cartel and mercs don't care about his personal vendetta. They just want the problem eliminated. Throughout the morning, Lizzy maintained her routine. She visited the hardware store, walked through the park, stopped to chat with townspeople. all while mercenary teams tracked her movements, logging her patterns. "She's making this too easy," Marshall commented to his second-in-command. "Veterans don't just give up, especially not ones with her background." "Maybe she's tired," the subordinate suggested. "She is 90 years old." Marshall's expression darkened. "Age has nothing to do with it. I've seen her type before. The calm ones, the ones who've seen real war. They're the most dangerous." At the Midnight Serpents warehouse, Rogue was losing patience. "Just take the shot. What are you waiting for?" "Professional work requires professional patience," Marshall replied over the radio. "We'll do this right, or we don't do it at all." What none of them had noticed was the subtle change in the townspeople's movements. Every time Lizzy stopped to chat, information was passed. Every friendly wave contained signals. The Veterans Guard hadn't withdrawn. They'd gone underground, blending with the civilian population. Rachel's voice came through Lizzie's concealed earpiece. "Cartel's moving product through the North Safe House. We've got it all on camera." "Good," Lizzie sub-vocalized, appearing to window shop. "Keep documenting." "How's our guest?" "Getting nervous," Rachel replied. "He's ready to talk." The guest was the city hall clerk who'd been feeding information to the Midnight Serpents. The Veterans Guard had picked him up quietly the night before, offering him a choice: full confession or federal charges. By late afternoon, Marshall had finished his preparation. His teams were in position, their fields of fire established, escape routes planned. To his professional eye, it was a perfect setup. "Green light for tonight," he informed his teams. "We end this after sunset." Rogue, listening on the radio, grinned savagely. "Finally." But in the growing darkness, other movements went unnoticed. Veterans who'd appeared to leave town were returning quietly, taking up hidden positions. Surveillance equipment recorded every mercenary's location, every cartel transaction, every Midnight Serpents movement. Lizzie sat in Diana's diner as night fell, sipping her coffee as calmly as ever. Through the window, she could see Marshall's SUV approaching. The mercenary commander had decided to handle this personally. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Marshall entered, accompanied by two of his men. The other customers, all Veterans Guard members in disguise, appeared to pay no attention. "Mrs. Winters," Marshall said smoothly, sliding into the booth across from her. "I think it's time we had a chat." Lizzie set down her coffee cup, meeting his cold gaze with one of her own. "I was wondering when you'd stop hiding behind your scope." "This is a professional courtesy," Marshall stated. "A chance to end this quietly." "Professional courtesy?" Lizzie's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Is that what we're calling murder for hire now?" Marshall's expression didn't change. "You've caused problems for people who don't tolerate problems. Walk away now, or don't walk away at all." "I've faced better men than you," Lizzie replied calmly. "Men who fought for something beyond a paycheck." "What are you really fighting for, Marshall?" For just a moment, something flickered in the mercenary's eyes. Doubt, perhaps. Or recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by professional coldness. "You have 1 hour to leave town," he said standing. "After that, whatever happens isn't personal. It's just business." As Marshall and his men left the diner, Lizzie smiled slightly. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The mercenaries were committed to their course of action, the cartel was moving their product, and Rogue was about to learn a harsh lesson about true strength. The next hour would change everything. But not in the way Marshall or Rogue expected. Because while they'd been watching Lizzie, they'd missed what was happening in the shadows. And in those shadows, a trap 90 years in the making was about to spring shut. The hour Marshall had given Lizzie ticked away in tense silence. Night had fully claimed Duskwood, transforming familiar streets into a maze of shadows and hidden threats. From his command vehicle, Marshall watched the timer on his tactical display count down the final minutes. "All teams, final position check," he ordered, his voice cold and professional. "Team 1, in position. Team 2, ready. Team 3, target acquired. Team 4, green." Lizzy remained in her booth at Diana's diner, seemingly oblivious to the deadline. She appeared to be doing a crossword puzzle, though her pen hadn't moved in several minutes. "Target hasn't moved," a spotter reported. Still at the diner, no sign of Veterans Guard activity. Marshall frowned slightly. In his experience, veterans never gave up this easily, especially not ones with combat experience. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't identify what. "Sir," his second-in-command spoke up, "cartels reporting unusual traffic patterns on the outskirts of town." "Specify," Marshall demanded. "Nothing concrete, just gaps in their surveillance. Moments where their cameras go dark." At the Midnight Serpents warehouse, Havoc paced nervously. The cartel representatives watched him with growing irritation. "This should have been handled days ago," one of them said. "Your personal vendetta is becoming expensive." "Just wait," Havoc snapped. "Once the old woman's gone, everything goes back to normal." The cartel man's smile was razor-thin. "Nothing goes back to normal. After tonight, there are going to be changes in how things run here." In the diner, Lizzy glanced at her watch. Through her concealed earpiece, she heard Rachel's voice. "Everything's in position. DEA teams are standing by." "Understood," Lizzy sub-vocalized. "Time to show our hand." The hour Marshall had given reached 0. He raised his radio, preparing to give the order that would end this conflict permanently. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. Every light in Duskwood went out simultaneously. For a moment, the town was plunged into total darkness. Then, one by one, powerful spotlights blazed to life from hidden positions, illuminating the mercenaries' sniper nests and surveillance points with brilliant clarity. "We're compromised," Team 2 shouted over the radio. "Multiple hostiles closing fast." Marshall grabbed his night vision goggles, scanning the suddenly chaotic scene. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Veterans Guard hadn't withdrawn. They'd simply changed positions. Now they were emerging from hiding spots throughout the town, their movements displaying the precision of extensive planning. "All teams, fall back to secondary positions," Marshall ordered, but it was too late. "Team 4 is pinned down. Team 1 taking fire. We've lost contact with Team 3. In the diner, Lizzy stood calmly, walking to the window as chaos erupted outside. Diana and the other customers revealed themselves as Veterans Guard members, moving with practiced efficiency to secure the building. "Marshall." Lizzy spoke into a radio of her own, knowing the mercenary commander would be monitoring all frequencies. "I believe we need to have another chat about professional courtesy." Outside, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Not military choppers, but DEA aircraft moving into position. The cartel's safe houses were being surrounded by federal agents who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "You planned this," Marshall's voice came through the radio, a hint of admiration mixing with his professional detachment. "The patterns, the predictability, it was all a setup." "Of course it was," Lizzy replied. "Did you really think a Vietnam veteran would be that careless? Every move we made was designed to draw you in, make you commit your forces exactly where we wanted them." At the Midnight Serpents warehouse, panic was setting in. The cartel representatives were already trying to flee, only to find their escape routes cut off by federal agents. Rogue stood in the middle of the chaos, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is how real veterans fight," Lizzy continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Not with brute force, but with strategy. Not with fear, but with precision." Marshall's SUV squealed around a corner, only to find its path blocked by Veterans Guard vehicles. Every escape route, every fallback position, every contingency plan had been anticipated and countered. "You have two choices," Lizzy informed him. "Surrender now and face federal charges, or try to fight your way out against men who've spent their lives perfecting the art of warfare. What's it going to be, Marshal? What's the professional choice?" For a long moment, silence filled the radio frequencies. Then, with the resignation of a man who knew when he was beaten, Marshall's voice came through. "Stand down," he ordered his teams. "Stand down all units." The mercenaries, professional to the end, followed their commander's order. One by one, they emerged from their positions, hands raised. But this wasn't over yet, because while the professionals had surrendered, Rogue and his Midnight Serpents were still unaccounted for, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. The night was about to get even darker before dawn could break over Duskwood again. Rogue stood in the Midnight Serpents warehouse, watching his world collapse through security monitors. DEA agents were leading away cartel members in handcuffs. Marshall's mercenaries were surrendering with professional dignity. Everything he'd built was crumbling. "It's over," Axel said quietly. "We need to surrender." "Over?" Rogue's laugh held an edge of madness. "That old woman thinks she's won. She hasn't seen what I'm really capable of." He strode to a locked storage room, punching in a code. The door swung open to reveal what the cartel had been storing. Enough explosives to level half of downtown Duskwood. "Boss?" Snake Tattoo stepped back, eyes wide. "That's too far. We're bikers, not terrorists." "We're whatever I say we are," Rogue shouted, already loading explosives into a van. "If I can't have Duskwood, neither can she." At Veterans Guard headquarters, Rachel's voice cracked with urgency over the radio. "Lizzy, we've got movement at the warehouse. Thermal imaging shows them loading something into vehicles." "What kind of something?" Steel Jack asked, watching the feeds. Based on the thermal signatures, Rachel's voice trailed off. "Explosives? Military grade?" Lizzy's mind raced through possibilities. This wasn't about territory anymore. This wasn't even about pride. This was about destruction. "All units," she commanded, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Rogue's gone rogue. He's got enough explosives to destroy the town. We need to stop him before he reaches any populated areas." The Veterans Guard mobilized instantly, their bikes roaring to life. Even the surrendered mercenaries looked concerned. Professional killers had lines they wouldn't cross, and Rogue had just crossed them. "You're not going out there." Steel Jack protested as Lizzy headed for her car. "The hell I'm not," she replied. "This started with me, and I'm going to finish it." The Midnight Serpents burst out of their warehouse in a convoy of bikes and vans, Rogue leading the charge. Many of his own gang members had refused to follow him this far, but those who remained were the most dangerous. Men with nothing left to lose. "He's heading for downtown," Rachel reported, tracking their movement. "If those explosives detonate near the historic district." "He won't get that far," Lizzy assured her, pulling out of the parking lot. Her old Ford Taurus wouldn't win any races, but she knew something Rogue didn't. She knew Duskwood streets better than anyone. The night erupted into a high-speed chase through the streets of Duskwood. Veterans Guard bikes pursued the Midnight Serpents while police and federal agents scrambled to evacuate potential targets. Rogue's laughter crackled over intercepted radio frequencies, the sound of a man who'd lost everything except his desire for revenge. "You should have left well enough alone, old woman," he taunted. "Now everyone gets to see what real power looks like." Lizzy didn't respond to his taunts. She took a sharp turn down an alley, her mind calculating angles and distances just as she had in Vietnam when plotting rescue routes. "Rachel," she called over the radio. "Remember that construction site on Maple Street? The new shopping center? What about it? Have units get ahead of Rogue. Force him to turn east on 3rd, Steel Jack's voice came through. The construction site's a dead end. Exactly, Lizzy replied. The Veterans Guard moved into position, their bikes herding the Midnight Serpents convoy exactly where Lizzy wanted them. Rogue, focused on his mission of destruction, didn't realize he was being maneuvered until it was too late. The convoy burst onto the construction site, only to find themselves trapped. Concrete barriers blocked every exit except the way they'd come in. And that was now filled with Veterans Guard bikes. Rogue leaped from his bike, pulling a detonator from his jacket. Back off. One click and this whole place goes up. Lizzy's Taurus rolled to a stop at the site entrance. She stepped out slowly, her movements deliberate. Is this what you wanted, Rogue? She called out. To prove you're the most dangerous man in Duskwood? Congratulations. You've proved you're willing to kill innocent people to satisfy your ego. Shut up, Rogue screamed, his hands shaking on the detonator. You did this. You turned everyone against me. No, Lizzy replied, taking a step forward. You did that yourself. Every time you chose fear over respect. Every time you mistook cruelty for strength. The remaining Midnight Serpents looked uncertainly between their leader and the growing force surrounding them. They'd signed up for a gang, not a suicide mission. One more step and I'll do it, Rogue threatened. I'll take us all out. Lizzy continued walking forward, her eyes locked on his. No, you won't. Because deep down, you're still that scared little boy trying to prove he's tough. Real strength isn't about who you can hurt, Rogue. It's about who you can protect. For a moment, something flickered in Rogue's eyes. Doubt, fear, maybe even understanding. Then his finger tightened on the detonator. But before he could click it, a shot rang out. Axel, his oldest friend and lieutenant, had made his choice. The bullet struck Rogue's hand, sending the detonator flying. The Midnight Serpent's last stand ended not with an explosion, but with the click of handcuffs and the quiet sobs of a broken man. As federal agents secured the explosives and led the remaining gang members away, Lizzy stood watching the scene. The night had almost turned tragic, but something else had happened instead. Redemption of sorts had come from within the gang itself. You knew, Steel Jack said, joining her. You knew someone would stop him. I knew his own people would make the right choice, Lizzy replied. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's helping them find their conscience. Dawn was approaching, and with it the promise of a new day for Duskwood. But the story wasn't quite over yet. There was still one more lesson to be learned, one more truth to be revealed. The morning after Rogue's arrest dawned clear and quiet over Duskwood. The Midnight Serpents warehouse was being processed by federal agents, its secrets finally exposed to daylight. Downtown, business owners open. Ed their shops without fear for the first time in months. Lizzy sat in her usual booth at Diana's diner, watching the town come alive. Steel Jack joined her, sliding a fresh cup of coffee across the table. DEA found enough evidence to put Rogue away for decades, he reported. The cartel connection alone carries a 20-year minimum sentence. And the others? Lizzy asked, thinking of the gang members who'd refused to follow their leader's final madness. Axel's cooperating with authorities, most of the Serpents are facing lesser charges. The ones who walked away before the explosives incident might get deals. Diana approached their table, coffee pot in hand. You should see what's happening out there. Former Serpents are helping clean up the damage from last week's fires. Some of them came to apologize. Through the window, Lizzy could see it happening. Men who'd once terrorized the town were now working alongside Veterans Guard members, clearing debris and repairing damage. Their leather vests still bore the Midnight Serpents insignia, but something fundamental had changed. They're lost, Steel Jack observed. Their leaders gone. Their purpose destroyed. They need direction. Lizzy nodded slowly, an idea forming. Maybe that's exactly what they need. A new purpose. A chance to be part of something better. Rachel Chen arrived with a stack of papers. Her expression mixing exhaustion with satisfaction. Marshall and his mercenaries are being transferred to federal custody, but there's something interesting. He asked to speak with you first. In a secure room at the police station, Marshall sat handcuffed to a table. His professional demeanor remained intact despite his situation. When Lizzy entered, he stood as much as his restraints allowed, a soldier's respect for a superior officer. You outmaneuvered us completely, he said without preamble. I've been running operations for 15 years. Never saw anything like it. Because you were looking for the wrong things, Lizzy replied, taking a seat. You saw an old woman, a small town. You never saw the spirit of the place, the strength of its people. Marshall nodded slowly. I saw the tactical situation. You saw the human one. That's why you won. Is that all you wanted to tell me? No, Marshall leaned forward slightly. I wanted to offer my services. When I get out, and I will eventually, I'd like to work for you. The Veterans Guard could use someone with my expertise. Lizzy studied him for a moment. You're right, we could. But only if you understand what we really fight for. It's not about money or power. It's about protection, community, making things better. I understand, Marshall replied. And for the first time, his professional mask cracked slightly. That's why I'm offering. Back on the streets of Duskwood, change was spreading like ripples in a pond. The remaining Midnight Serpents, those who'd chosen redemption over destruction, were finding their place in the community they'd once terrorized. Tom Mason had hired 2 of them to help rebuild his hardware store. They're good workers, he told Lizzy. Just needed someone to give them a chance. At the VA center, Rachel was organizing a new program. One that would help former gang members transition into productive lives. Several Veterans Guard members had volunteered as mentors. It's like you said, Rachel explained to Lizzy. Sometimes the biggest victory is helping people find their conscience. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. There were still tensions, still doubts and suspicions to overcome. But something fundamental had shifted in Duskwood. The town had faced its darkness and emerged stronger. Not through violence, but through understanding. Steel Jack found Lizzy watching sunset from her porch that evening. You planned this all along, didn't you? Not just stopping Rogue, but changing things completely. Not exactly, Lizzy smiled. But I hoped. Sometimes people just need to be shown a better way. Even the ones we think are beyond reach. A motorcycle rumbled past her house. One of the former Midnight Serpents, now wearing both his old vest and a new patch. Duskwood Community Watch. They're calling you the heart of Duskwood now, Steel Jack said. The one who believed in second chances. Lizzy shook her head. I just remembered something I learned in Vietnam. The real battle isn't always with the enemy in front of you. Sometimes it's with the darkness inside people. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating that darkness. It's helping it find the light. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across Duskwood streets. But these shadows no longer held fear. They were just reminders of how far the town had come and how far it could still go. The war was over, but something more important had begun. The process of healing. Of transformation. Of finding strength not in fear, but in unity. And it had all started with one phone call. Made by a 90-year-old veteran who refused to give up on her town or its people. Even the ones who thought they were beyond redemption. 1 year later, Duskwood had transformed into something no one could have predicted. The morning sun rose over a town that had not just survived its darkest hour, but had been reborn through it. Lizzy Winters, now 91, sat in her familiar booth at Diana's diner, watching the street outside with quiet satisfaction. The Veterans Guard still maintained their presence, but they'd evolved into something more than just protectors. Their headquarters in the old factory had become a community center, offering job training, counseling, and support for anyone seeking to rebuild their life. "Morning, Miss Lizzy," called a familiar voice. It was Snake Tattoo. Though he went by his real name, James now. His leather vest still bore the Midnight Serpents insignia, but above it was a new patch. Veterans Guard. Civilian Auxiliary. "How's the mentorship program going, James?" Lizzy asked as he joined her with his own coffee cup. "Got 3 more former gang members starting next week," he smiled. "Word spreading to other towns. People want to know how Duskwood did it." Through the window, Lizzy could see other changes. Tom Mason's hardware store was thriving, now run jointly by Tom and 2 former serpents who'd discovered a talent for business. Diana's Diner had become a gathering place where veterans and reformed gang members sat together, sharing stories and wisdom. Steel Jack entered, taking his usual seat across from Lizzy. "Just got word from Marshall," he reported. "He's getting early release for cooperation. Still wants to join up when he's out." "Good," Lizzy nodded. "We can use men who understand both sides of the line." Rachel Chen arrived next, carrying a thick folder. "The government's interested in our rehabilitation program. They want to use Duskwood as a model for other communities facing similar issues." "Tell them it's not about programs," Lizzy replied. "It's about believing people can change if you give them the chance." Outside, a group of motorcycles rolled past. Veterans Guard members riding alongside former Midnight Serpents. Their bikes no longer symbols of intimidation, but of unity. They were heading to the old warehouse district, now being renovated into affordable housing and small businesses. "Remember when this all started?" Steel Jack asked, watching the riders pass. "One phone call." "One phone call," Lizzy agreed. But it was never really about that. It was about showing people a different kind of strength. Axel, now the civilian coordinator for the Community Watch program, appeared in the doorway. "They're ready for you at the ceremony, Lizzy." The ceremony was being held in the town square, where a new memorial was being dedicated. Not to conflict or victory, but to transformation. The crowd that gathered represented every facet of Duskwood. Veterans, former gang members, business owners, and families all standing together. As Lizzy took the podium, she looked out over the faces before her. Each one told a story of change, of redemption, of finding a better way. A year ago, she began. Duskwood stood at a crossroads. We could have chosen vengeance, could have fought fire with fire. Instead, we chose something harder. We chose to believe in the power of change. The memorial behind her bore a simple inscription. Strength through unity, peace through understanding. Look around you, Lizzy continued. What you see isn't just a town that survived. It's proof that the hardest battles aren't won with fists or weapons, but with courage, compassion, and the willingness to see the good in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. As she spoke, a lone motorcycle approached. It was Rogue's younger brother, recently released from jail. He'd written to Lizzy from prison, asking if Duskwood's second chance is extended to family. Her answer had been simple. Come home. We'll help you find your way. We've built something here that's stronger than fear, Lizzy concluded. Something that can't be broken because it's founded not on power over others, but on power with them. That's the real legacy of Duskwood. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words. It was for everything they'd accomplished together. For the town that had faced its demons and emerged stronger. For the people who had found the courage to change. Later, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold, Lizzy sat on her porch with Steel Jack and Rachel. The sound of motorcycles in the distance no longer brought tension, only a reminder of how far they'd come. You know, Steel Jack mused, when you made that first call, I thought we were just going to run some troublemakers out of town. So did I, Lizzie admitted. But sometimes the best victories are the ones you never planned for. A group of children rode past on bicycles, followed by a veterans guard escort. Not because they needed protection anymore, but because the riders had become part of the community's extended family. The town's calling it the Duskwood miracle, Rachel mentioned. But it wasn't really a miracle, was it? No, Lizzie smiled, watching the last rays of sun paint the streets she'd helped to transform. It was just people discovering their better selves. Sometimes they just need someone to believe they can. As night fell over Duskwood, lights came on in homes and businesses. The town was alive with the sound of community, people gathering, talking, sharing meals and stories. The darkness that had once held fear now held only promise. And somewhere in that peaceful night, a 91-year-old veteran sat watching over the town she'd helped save, knowing that sometimes the greatest battles aren't the ones we fight against others, but the ones we fight for them. That had been the real victory in Duskwood. Not defeating an enemy, but transforming one. Not winning a war, but ending the need for one. One phone call had started it all, but it was love, courage, and belief in the power of change that had finished it. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.